Good evening. In 1992, an AJC study taken in the United States and the United Kingdom found that only 54% of those questioned knew what the term the Holocaust referred to. Only 58% of those in the 60-plus age bracket were able to answer the question, with the percentage decreasing to 46% of those in the age 18 to 29 bracket. A 1993 survey called What Do Americans Know About the Holocaust, based on questionnaires filled out by 992 adults and 506 high school students, with questions that measured the basic knowledge of the Holocaust, from over one-third to just under two-thirds of American adults and American high school students failed to answer the questions correctly. These questions included, as far as you know, what does the Holocaust refer to? Only 38% of adults and 53% of high school students said that they didn't know or offered completely incorrect answers. From what you know or what you have heard, what were Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka? 62% of adults and 48% of high school students answered concentration camps. However, 38% of adults and 51% of high school students said that either they didn't know or were unable to give the correct answer. Approximately how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust? Only 35% of adults and 28% of youths knew the answer. 65% of the adults and 71% of the students said that they didn't know or answered incorrectly. The numbers, as time goes on, decrease. A worldwide study by the ADL in 2014 indicated that only 54% had heard of the Shoah. 32% had heard of the Shoah, but believed it to be a myth or greatly exaggerated. While it is understandable, though not acceptable, that the highest percentage of the lack of knowledge and belief of exaggeration is found in the Arab nations in the Middle East, how can we explain that only 77% of the people in the Americas have heard of the Shoah, and that 21% believe that it is a myth or exaggerated? We are living in difficult times. History recedes, the world's memory fades. As survivors pass from the scene, and more of those who bore witness are no longer here to tell their stories, the need for succeeding generations to keep those memories alive becomes that much greater. It is incumbent upon all of us here to tell our children and our children's children so that no one ever forgets all that was lost. Not only 6 million neshamot, but the generations upon generations that would have followed. We must be ever vigilant and ensure that they are not forgotten.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in there, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Benima,
upon Rabbi Schwab, from Schwab of Congregation Eitz Chaim of Dogwood Park for Tehillim.
Abratzech Mizmor David, Yancha Adonai b'yom Sarai Yisagevcha, Shem Elai Yaakov, Yishlach Ezrika Mikodesh, Mitzion Yisadeka, Yizkor Kol Mincha Yisecha, V'lascha Yadash Nasela, Yitein Lecha Chil Babecha, V'chol Asascha Yimalei, V'ranana B'Yishuasecha, V'Shem Eloheinu Nidgol, Yimalei Adonai Kol Mishalosecha, Ata Yadati, Ki Yoshi Adonai Mishicha, Yadneu Mishmei Kadsha, Big Burris, Yesha Yamino, Eila Varecha Ve'ela V'Susim, V'nachnu B'Shem Adonai Eloheinu Naskir, Hema Karu V'Nafalu, V'anachnu Kamnu Misadad, Adonai Yoshia Melech Yaneinu V'yom Kareinu. The Psalm of David, may Hashem answer you on the day of distress. May the name of Jacob's God make you impregnable. May dispatch your help from the sanctuary and support you from Zion. May remember all your offerings and consider your burnt sacrifices generous. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill your every plan. May we sing for joy at his salvation and raise our banners in the name of our God. May Hashem fulfill all your requests. Now I know that Hashem has saved his anointed one. He will answer him from his sacred heaven. We have the omnipotent victories of his right arm, some with chariots and some with horses, but we, in the name of Hashem, our God, call out. They slumped and fell, but we arose and were invigorated. Hashem save. May the King answer us on the day we call.
In a collection of the last letters of the Shoah, which were put together in a volume to read through the final words, the final messages, the last wills and testaments of many who perished and a few who survived. In some, they describe great destruction, horror, tragedy. In one letter, dated April 7th, 1943, to my dear one, before I depart from this world, I would like to leave some words for you. If you ever receive this letter, I and all of us here will no longer be alive. Our end is coming near. We feel this and know it. We are all doomed to death, like all those innocent Jews who have already been executed. I could tell you so much, but how is it possible to describe all the nightmare and anguish that we are experiencing? The pen cannot relate the tragedy of our people in this blood-drenched country. The agonies, the destructive cruelty to oppress human beings, to agitate them, chase, degrade, and finally kill them. At the beginning, we were squeezed like lemons. Our blood was sucked to the last drop. And finally, we were thrown into the sewer ditch. At the beginning, our hearts were torn away. We were robbed of all our human emotions and human instincts. And after turning into beasts, working in a mechanical way, we were slain en masse. You cannot grasp this. You cannot feel what we ourselves felt. A person who thinks in a normal way will never believe that it's possible to withstand these tortures, and that in the 20th century, atrocities like these are possible. And he goes on to describe in great detail the horrible experiences of those years. In another letter that was found in a crate buried in the Warsaw Ghetto, a crate full of art, there was a message from an artist, Gela Sackstein. And she writes in her last moments of life, "As I stand on the boundary between life and death, Certain that I will not live any longer, I would like to part from my friends and from my works of art. 10 years of work. I assembled, tore up, and again worked on preparing exhibitions of my paintings, especially the exhibition, Portraits of a Jewish Child. I'm currently saving, if this is possible, whatever can be saved, and whatever is appropriate to the limitation of space. I leave all of it here, abandoned in the hand of fate. Tens of oil paintings, portraits of Jewish writers, sketches, and more. I do not seek praise. I would only want some remembrance, some memory to remain of me and my little daughter, the talented young girl, Margalit. I donate my works of art to the Jewish Museum, which will hopefully be established in the future in order to rehabilitate the world of Jewish art prior to the war. And she concludes, I am calm now. I have to die. But I did what I was assigned to do. I am trying to preserve a memento of my works of art. Farewell, my friends and acquaintances. Farewell to the Jewish people. Do not allow such a destruction to repeat itself. As Gela Sackestein requested, she just wants a memory, some remembrance to remain that there once lived a person and her daughter. It is for that and to carry their memory with us that we gather tonight to remember she, her daughter, and the 6 million Jews whose lives were taken in a gruesome and horrible way too soon. And we carry that on, and we remember them as we light candles in their memory.
We will now call upon survivors and family members of survivors to light 6 candles. First candle, Nechama Tabor and Jean Chapnick. Second candle, Marcel Teitelbaum. Third candle, Rebecca Glassman and Judy Eisenman. Fourth candle, Debbie Sadoff and Sharon Sendick-Schulman. Fifth candle, Irving Reinstein. And the final candle, Celia Rupert and Helen Rosenstark.
I don't remember a time when, to some extent or another, I wasn't aware of what happened to the Jews during World War II. I may not have known the words Holocaust or Shoah, but I always knew that something terrible had been done to the Jews, and that my family had also been affected by it. Growing up surrounded by my grandmother, aunts, uncles, and others who had gone through the Shoah was part of my life. However, this isn't my story, but my parents' story. I stand here as a child of people who survived and witnessed to what they and millions of other Jews went through the Shoah. I stand here to relate just a small portion of the stories that I heard countless times from my parents, because they cannot, whether because of distance, as in my father's case, or because of no longer being with us, as in my mother's Alaa Shalom case. My father's story. My father, Joseph Silber, was born in 1921 in Shatar Ola Uyhe, a small town in northeast Hungary. He was the second of 4 children, with an older brother, Kalman, younger sister, Lily, and a younger brother, Miklos. In 1925, my father's family moved to Debrecen, the city where subsequently my brother and I were born. It was the second largest city in Hungary, and at the time home to the second largest Jewish community, with almost 10,000 Jews representing approximately 10% of the population. Growing up, my father and his brothers attended the Orthodox elementary school for grades 1 to 4. They attended secondary or high school, or as it was known in Hungary, gymnasium, for grades 5 to 12. The school wasn't a religious one, so they attended gymnasium till noon and then went to a cheder till 6 o'clock to learn religious studies. In the gymnasium, the curriculum was 8 years Latin, 8 years German, 4 years French, besides history, math, and the sciences. And this was in addition to learning Hungarian, Yiddish, and Hebrew. My father came from a Zionistic family, and he was a leader in Hanoar Hatzioni, or Zionist youth, responsible for the education and culture curriculum. His father imported watches and watch parts from Switzerland and Germany and sold them wholesale. At the time, there was a strict quota, or numerus clausus, that was in effect, limiting to 4% the number of Jews that could attend higher education. As a result, after my father graduated high school, my grandfather suggested to him become a watchmaker. My father would have left to have been a lawyer. My father apprenticed and after a year was qualified to be a watchmaker on his own. This trade was very important later on when he was sent to a labor camp. In 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and the Hungarian government, to show support for Germany, sent some military units to the Ukrainian front. They also sent some Jewish labor units to clear minefields. They had no proper clothing against the harsh winter or training to remove mines. My father's older brother Kalman was among those sent to the front in late 1942, and the family had no information regarding him until January 1943. At that time, a notice came from the International Red Cross informing them that he disappeared at the front, and they were unaware of his whereabouts. His family thought that he may have been captured by the Russians, but later found out that some of the men had become ill with typhus, and the Hungarians had closed them in their barracks and burned them. He was 24 years old. In October 1942, my father was taken to a labor camp about 50 kilometers outside of Debrecen. My father's older brother, who was already in the camp for a while and had connections with the people in the camp's office, told my father that a request had been received from Budapest that there was a factory looking for tradesmen. When a few days later the officer in charge came and asked who's an electrician, my father immediately raised his hand. Of course, my father had no training as an electrician, but that didn't matter. So along with approximately 20 other young men, he arrived to the factory in Budapest. The factory, which was situated on the grounds of a large army base, manufactured folding shovels for the military. He wasn't asked what his training was, but was assigned to a machine. We had to press a lever, stamp out something from metal. In the beginning, the situation was lax enough that every weekend the men could leave and go to the city. Most of the men were from Budapest. The officers and soldiers were frequently paid off, and if someone needed a few days off to visit family, they could obtain an official permission slip. My father was able to rent a room in Budapest from a couple, where he managed to keep a change of clothes. Once the officers and soldiers discovered that my father was a watchmaker, all of a sudden everyone had a watch that needed repair. This gave my father the opportunity to get out of the camp and supposedly buy parts for the repair. In March 1944, Germany invaded Hungary, and in July, America started bombing Budapest. As a result of these bombings, the laborers were relocated to a textile factory outside of the city. On the 15th of October 1944, the Hungarian head, Admiral Horthy, announced that Hungary had signed an armistice with the Soviet Union. The army ignored him, and the Nazis quickly took full control in Hungary. During that interval, many of the workers, thinking that the war would be over soon, fled the factory, my father among them. My father went to stay with a man in Budapest who had known him in Debrecen, my father's hometown. He was also a watchmaker, and I told my father he could stay with him any time he was in trouble. The first night as he was sleeping, his friend woke him up and told him that he had to leave because the Nazis were in the building looking for Jews. He dressed quickly and left, wandering all night, having no place where to go and no identity papers. He had no other choice but to go back to the camp. He had to take a train and get back, and it was then that my father had what could only be described as a miraculous escape. 2 gendarmes came on the train and called out loudly, "We're looking for Jews." At the time, my father had a nice raincoat, a Borsalino hat, and newly shined shoes. He made believe he was sleeping. When the gendarmes came walking through, they looked at him and his clothing and then left, probably thinking that someone who was from the labor camp couldn't be dressed so nicely. Had he been caught, he would have undoubtedly sent to a concentration camp or killed on the spot. Shortly after returning to the labor camp, the Zionist organization was able to provide my father with false documents showing he's an employee of the International Red Cross. My father at that time heard of the Glass House, a large glass factory building which would serve as a safe house and was going to open under the protection of the Swiss government. Very few of the Red Cross documents were distributed and provided the holders some protection from arrest. With it, my father again left the camp for the last time and went to the Glass House. He was among the first 50 people who settled there. At the end, there were almost 2,000 people staying in the Glass House. Eventually, because of the overcrowding, my father moved to yet another safe house, and it was from there that he was liberated by the Russians on January 16, 1945. I'll come back to the importance of that date later. Meanwhile, in Debrecen, my father's hometown, an order was issued on April 28, 1944 to erect a ghetto. The Jews were forced to build the ghetto walls and finished it in less than a month on May 15, 1944. My grandparents were able to escape from the ghetto with my father's youngest brother and sister and hid in the attic of the Orthodox shul. They were able to hide there for 3 weeks, but eventually had to leave. They were caught by the police and sent to Auschwitz. After the war, my aunt related that when they arrived, Dr. Mengele told her and the mother to run to see if they were fit for work. While both were let through on the first day, 2 days later, he saw that my grandmother, who was 52 years old at the time, had varicose veins. She was then separated from my aunt, who never saw her again. Her yahrzeit is on the 18th of Av. Regarding my grandfather, my father only found out after the war that his father had passed away from influenza on the 11th of Nisan. He never found out what happened to his younger brother. My father observes his older and younger brother's yahrzeit on the same day as he does his father's. My mother's story. My mother was born in 1922 in Brustra, in the area of the Carpathian Mountains on the border of Galicia and Hungary. At that time was part of Czechoslovakia, but is now part of Ukraine and is known as Lopukhiv. The village had approximately 60 Jewish families. She was the fifth of 8 children with 3 older sisters, an older brother, and 3 younger sisters. Her father was relatively well off, owning a forest and lumber business. I always think of it as kind of a Walton's Mountain. My brother, who's a professor of Hungarian Jewish history at Hebrew University, found a list that had been compiled by the Hungarian Ministry of Agriculture of land owned by the Jews in 1941, so they can confiscate it in 1942. The list of Brustra land owned by my grandfather's extended family and of cousins and uncles came to 40 square kilometers. By comparison, Manhattan is 59 square kilometers. Perhaps Mr. Burris can help reclaim some of that land later. In 1940, Transylvania was split between Hungary and Romania. Once the Hungarians took over, the situation was a very pleasant one. So in late 1941, my grandparents, along with my mother and 4 of her sisters, moved to Debrecen, where her older brother was also living, already married and with children. It happened that they rented an apartment 3 buildings away from where my father lived. Even before this, there was a connection between my parents' families because cousins from each side had married each other. At the wedding, my mother and my father's sister had met each other. So when my mother moved to Debrecen, my aunt invited her and an older sister over one Shabbat afternoon. It was late after Havdalah when they left. My parents immediately felt something click, and it was the start of an almost 60-year relationship. With the invasion by the Germans in March 1944, my mother's family was forced to leave Debrecen. Eventually, they went back to my grandfather's forest in the Carpathian Mountains. He was well known and liked by the peasants living in the area. and with assistance from some of them, was able to dig a bunker under a large fallen tree. For 9 months, my grandparents, my mother, and 4 other girls hid in that bunker. My father's sister and 2 cousins were the sole survivors of Auschwitz from my father's family. Along with my father, only 4 members survived from his extended family. His father, mother, older brother, and younger brother perished. He estimates that all told, over 70 of his family members were killed. On my mother's side, her oldest sister, along with her husband and young children, were also killed. All told, out of 800,000 Jews living in Hungary before the war, 565,000 were murdered. My parents' story. A few days after my father was liberated, a friend met him and told him that my mother's family was in the city of Satmar. My father decided to go back to Debrecen and from there take a train to go to Satmar. At that time, there weren't regularly scheduled trains. The normally 4 to 5 hour trip to Debrecen took 2 days. He finally arrived to the house where he had lived. In a way, he was lucky, since the family who had moved in during the war to the apartment had just left the day before. He found completely empty rooms since all the furniture owned by Jews had been stored in the big synagogue. At the same time that my father was planning to go find my mother in Satmar, my mother had decided that she would come to Debrecen to see what was happening with her family's possession. She didn't know what had happened to my father. Upon arriving in the city, she met a friend who told her that my father was alive and had left for Satmar to meet her. My mother decided to first go to the apartment building where my father had lived. At the entrance of the building, there were 2 sets of doors that had to be opened to get in. So it happened that as my father opened the inside door to leave for Satmar, my mother opened up the outside door and they met in between. My parents married the 9th of Nisan, the Friday before Pesach. Later on, it gave my father great comfort knowing that his father and younger brother had still been alive at the time he married. My story. In November 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, my family escaped Hungary and eventually made it to the United States. How we did that is another story. We arrived January 16, 1957, the same date that my father was liberated by the Russians, and coincidentally, the same day that in 1961, my father opened his jewelry store on Madison Avenue. My parents used to celebrate that day as a day of thanks, Hadah. Now Randy and I, along with my children and their spouses and their children, carry on the tradition. I want to thank the committee for this opportunity to relate my parents' story. I started this story by saying that my story was of people who survived, not survivors. I always thought that children of survivors had a negative connotation, that the survivors and their children were struggling through some event. After the war, my parents, like many others, asked why and how could this happen? But they decided to move on, make a better life for themselves and their children, and ultimately that's what happened. When I mentioned to my father that I'd been invited to speak tonight, he asked me to relay his appreciation that the community holds a yearly Yom HaShoah commemoration and how important it was that as the number of survivors decreases each year, their story should continue to be told. Thank you.
It's my privilege to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Judge Donald Burris. When the Yemenite immigration to Israel occurred, the Yemenite Jews brought with them manuscripts of Medrashim, Homiletic literature, on the Chumash, and one remarkable Medrash indicated that the instruction given to the Jewish people to collect all of the possessions of their Egyptian oppressors was rooted in the fact that when Jewish male children were told to be executed, to be thrown into the sea, Egyptians extorted money, huge amounts of money, from the Jews in order to do so. Although Am Yisrael was prepared to leave and to sever themselves from brutal slavery, nevertheless the Almighty felt that every penny, everything needed to be restored. Because redemption requires tzedakah u'mishpat. And that redemption occurred, and consequently the Jewish people left knowing that the Egyptians did not take advantage of them. Judge Burris has spent over 20 years as an internationally renowned lawyer, spent 20 years of a 45-year career fighting for justice, for tzedakah u'mishpat. He is a lecturer in law, Loyola School of Law in Los Angeles, Georgetown Law Center, the U.S. Legal System Program in Washington, D.C. He is internationally acclaimed as an authority on the looting of Jewish art by the Nazis in יימח שמם before World War II and during World War II. Most significantly, he has appeared in front of the Supreme Court in the case Altman versus Republic of Austria, and there he successfully concluded that the Austrian government was ordered, the judges concluded, based on all of the research and based on the appearance of Judge Burris, all of the research that he did to reclaim all of those possessions, priceless historic paintings, and of course the film that was based upon that event, that successful appeal to the Supreme Court, the film Woman in Gold. Justice Judge Burris says, "Ani lo mevin harbe ivrit." He says he loves to visit Israel. He says to please translate all of the terms that I would use in introducing him. The words "staka mishpat Judge Burris" do not require translation. Your brilliant career in reclaiming possessions of Jewish art, that is the most beautiful and inspiring translation. I give you Judge Donald Burris.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I appreciate the overstatement. I'll do my best to help you all understand what I do and why it's important to all of us as Jews. Before I get into anything, I have to tell you that I'm very honored to be before the group of survivors that are here. I'm very honored to be here during the Holocaust Remembrance Week. I've just come from Minneapolis, where I went with the mayor and we spoke to the people in Minneapolis. I was in Pensacola, Florida. I'm well known, by the way, for finding Jews. And I've been to communities where you might think we don't have too many, but we're there, basically. And Lubbock, Texas, and Rocky Mount, North Carolina, Luxembourg, and other places, all due west, east, and the like. I have a few frequent flyer miles. I did want to apologize at the outset, because now that the two movies came out, Monuments Men and Women in Gold, when I'm advertised, so to speak, to be before a group like this, at least some of the people, particularly the women, believe George Clooney is coming. But I asked you to use your imagination. I'm a little older. I actually know him, and he's a very nice, very dedicated man. And then, of course, when Women in Gold came out, and the Weinsteins kind of featured my partner, Randy, who I'm very, very proud of, and who had the relationship with the Altman family, I had to explain also at the same time that what they did is they cast Ryan Reynolds as Randy. And if you look closely, I'm taller than Randy, and I have hair. So Ryan Reynolds, Randy, or me, who knows what's going to happen there. In a more serious vein, I'm here tonight, and the stories were touching and beautiful, and yes, we will do what we can to get at least some of that real property back. That's a whole other issue in terms of what happens. But I'm very touched to be around you, and I'm very touched that this many people would take their post-Shabbat evening and come and see what I had to say here. I actually, when Owen called me and he said, I'd like you to come to West Hempstead, you know where that is? I said, well, I went to high school in East Meadow, so I think I know where West Hempstead is. And in a way, my parents are long gone, and my sister is here tonight. She came to honor us. But it's not like I'm coming back to my family, but I'm coming back to my roots in a way. And it's the first time I've given 111 talks in 13 years. I did a little survey of this. First time I've been on Long Island, so thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back. Now, the other thing is that I recognize there's a very small fraternity and sorority of us who are out there doing what we're doing, maybe 20 lawyers in the United States. And I recognize that when we're talking about getting artwork back, it's hard at the beginning for people to shift their focus from the kinds of suffering that we heard about this evening and the kind of redemption we heard about and talk about art. But I think what really is very important and very important to focus on, and I think Owen talked about this by way of recognition, is the Nazi policy of trying to destroy Jewish culture and what we're able to do now in retrieving some of that culture and making some of the people feel that they have an identity again with it. There was a statement made, do you remember a few years ago, articles splashed all over the New York Times and the like about this apartment in Munich, and there was a kind of a petty criminal who was taking euros across country lines. Well, he was an older man. He turned out to be the son of Hitler's favorite art agent. And his father used to take the paintings and go back and forth and sell them in galleries in France or in neutral Spain or Portugal, or even try to smuggle them into the United States and the like. And when he died, of course, he left the paintings to his son. And his son had in his apartment not 2 or 3 paintings, but 1,400. And they, you may have heard of these guys, Pissarro, Degas, Chagall, people like that. You know, most people have heard of them, whether or not they actually are in the art field or the like. Well, a book came out about all of that, and there's a quote from that book that I like to use as a little overview in terms of explaining the Nazi policy, and I'll tell you how that was implemented and how we try to deal with it now. But the quote is as follows: "It is a gross misapprehension to believe that looted art is somehow a lesser crime of the Nazi era. Art is intended to unite people of disparate backgrounds in a combined cultural heritage that transcends national boundaries. The wholesale theft of art from museums, individuals, libraries, and archives was highly calculated and organized by the criminal regime of the Third Reich." The theft of Jewish art and Jewish property is the biggest property crime ever committed in the history of the world. They did a study, and they determined that if you added together the aggregate value of just the valuable artworks that were taken, not the little ones, but the real valuable ones, it came to about $2.5 billion in 1945 money, which translates now into about $20 billion in our money. And to give you a small example of this, when they opened up the apartment and they started to assess the paintings that they had picked up in Munich, those alone raised the tab about another $1 billion when you really looked at all of this. I get a lot of questions about that Munich apartment because it's Mr. Gerlich is in the news from time to time. He passed away. He left the paintings to a museum, a somewhat obscure museum in Switzerland, and they took the high ground. The Swiss Museum said, we'll take them, but we're going to establish that there's proper provenance, and we want to hear from the lawyers and the like. And there was kind of an irony, because it's hard. Provenance, by the way, is just a fancy word for the history of artwork when people are studying it. There's 2 basic concepts. I don't want to get overly technical in this regard, but as lawyers, we're also detectives. We're also supposed to be art mavens and the like, and we deal with authentication, which is that really something done by the artist that it's attributed to, and we deal with the question of provenance. Where was it? It is absolutely outrageous to suppose that anybody, a museum, a gallery, an individual owner, would purchase a painting where the provenance was shown as some gap between 1933 and 1945. There is no insurance that's enough to really deal with that situation, and certainly the questions abound whenever that happens. So that's one part of what happens here. But they were doing the initial studies, and ironically, they did locate a family with regard to a couple of paintings at the very beginning. And you know who it was? It was the ex-wife of the French political guy who was doing something with chambermaids in New York. This guy, you know, Mrs. Rosenberg. So he made a very bad decision. leaving his wife, who was very nice and had a wonderful collection, the Rosenberg collection, and whatever else he was doing. I know I'm in a synagogue, so I'll be very careful. Funny enough, 3 weeks ago, I was in a Catholic church, and I was speaking to the Catholics in media, and I explained to them that was the first Mass I had ever attended. So I'm trying to get ecumenical. Speaking of ecumenicism, you take pride in something, okay? And that something is that Jews and Israelis, not confine ourselves to just helping fellow Jews or relatives or clients or anyone like that. We are in the forefront. I don't mean me, I'm not trying to take credit for this, but those of us who are lawyers or doctors or administrators, we're in the forefront all over the world of trying to deal with this problem and these issues. We have a committee going called Lawyers of Conscience, and we try to really get into a situation where art is at stake, where culture is at stake, where there seems to be a need for people to recognize it and to try to stop it in some way. We're dealing to some extent with Iraq and Syria and some other situations. And there's been some inquiries made, interestingly enough, by Cubans who now want to think about, now that relations are being restored, what can they do about property in the end? And it's, it's kind of interesting to me because Randy, my partner, who was in the movie, Randy doesn't practice law anymore. He started the Holocaust Museum, which is absolutely wonderful in LA, really terrific museum. And so I'm left practicing law at my advanced age here in terms of what I'm doing. And I get literally dozens of phone calls every week. People think I can get anything back. I got a phone call the other day from a dentist in Delaware. He says, Mr. Burris, I saw the movie. I heard your firm can get everything back. I need my dental license back. I said, well, I really would like to help you, but I'm not sure that I can do that, not knowing Delaware dental law or anything else like that. Let's talk a little bit about these property crimes and the like. It was an absolute number one priority of German foreign policy to destroy our culture. So when they seized paintings and other personal property and things of value and desecrated Torahs and the like, it wasn't like you had a few members of the Wehrmacht that were coming through a town and they were just stealing things, left and right and giving out presents. They were directed to do so. It was a conscious effort. And at the same time, the Nazis were probably in addition, one of the most evil, not one of the most evil people on the face of the earth. I never knew Genghis Khan's people, so it's possible that they weren't really nice people either, but the Nazis were just horrible people, and at the same time, they were greedy. They were greedy. These stories of Hermann Göring sending railroad cars to France to pick up paintings and bring them to his castle that he had are totally true. Even in the depths of the war, when they needed the railroad cars for other things, militarily, they were using them to transport our people, and they were using them to steal the art in terms of what happened. And so this was a prevalent practice on their part. They were greedy. Hitler was, as you may know, a failed artist. Maria Altman, who was an incredible woman, Maria used to say that she wished that maybe Hitler was a little better artist. Maybe things would have turned out all right. By the way, I'm also asked, I assume a lot of you have seen Woman in Gold. It's a pretty decent movie. And you've seen, on a serious vein, you've seen Monuments Men. And so I'm asked sometimes, what's accurate? What's not accurate, okay? I can tell you one thing. Maria did a lot more than just make strudel for people for 5 or 6 years. She was an incredible support base in terms of what happened there, and it was just an amazing thing to work with her. I can tell you, I've been practicing law, as the rabbi suggested. By the way, I'm not a judge in the permanent sense of the word. The rabbi kindly picked up on my resume that I get appointed as a judge in California from time to time. But it sounded good. I really kind of liked it, And I heard it's on tape, so maybe I'll keep the tape in terms of what's happening there. So we have these greedy people. We have these people who want to destroy our culture, not allow us to do what we're doing tonight, to attend a lecture, to look at our artwork, or to have a connection with our family and the like. And where did they take this stuff? Well, they put some of it in salt mines. They collected some of the jus de palme in Paris. You may have seen the movie Monuments Men. There was a heroine like Kate Blanchett, but didn't look like Kate Blanchett. But there was somebody like that, so that was true. There was never an incident, a reported incident of a monument man going back to a Jewish house and bringing a painting back, unfortunately, because that wasn't their job. The Monuments Men job, and I give Dwight Eisenhower a lot of credit. He really was supportive on this, and fortunately, Roosevelt did not turn his back on it. FDR, we have some problems with about World War II, but we're not here for that tonight. Eisenhower, as soon as the Normandy invasion was planned, he said, I want a series of troops that are assigned to the preservation of culture. I want them to be in the forefront. When the battles are being drawn, I want them in the front lines. I want them to deal with the soldiers. I want them to do what they can to preserve everything. And let's move on. It was not Matt Damon and George Clooney and 5 other men went all through Europe and saved all the culture. For one thing, we got to change the name. It's not Monuments Men, it's Monuments People. There's hundreds of women that really helped out. For another, there were hundreds of people, others that were not. Well, there's a book, Monuments Men, that the movie's based on. And when you read the book and look at the pictures, the only one of the actors, you know, John Goodman was in the movie and some other people, Bill Murray, the only one of the actors who actually looked like the American actor counterpart was Clooney's character. And the photograph that you look at in page 2 or 3 of the book really contains something that's kind of interesting. But their job, the Monuments Men job, was to hopefully not allow any destruction or to minimize the destruction that was going to occur in connection with the battles that were being fought. And then ultimately to get the artwork back to the countries of origin. In other words, not necessarily to the families, because that was too difficult and that would take too long, but to the countries. So they would give it back to Holland, they would give it back to Germany, even, you know, to the extent it was looted from Jewish families in Germany and taken elsewhere. They would give it back to Austria, and they would give it back to various countries. Now, it's interesting when we deal with these countries now, because what the Monuments Men did was called external restitution. Let's get the paintings back to the countries. What we have to do, our little fraternity and sorority, is to try to accommodate what we call internal restitution. Here are the paintings. In the case of Maria Altman, they're in a state museum. Let's internally figure out who really owns them, which people should get them back and the like. And I do, I found someone the other day in Minneapolis, I do in my head like a yellow pad, a sliding scale of the countries. All the countries that the Nazis overran. Every country except Poland has a statute that says, in theory, you shall return stolen property when it's discovered. Poland's working on it. They've been working on it since 1945. Now, I do a sliding scale in my head. There's a total tie in baseball terms. I'm a big baseball fan. The cellar dwellers equally are Poland and Austria. Do you know what the best country is to deal with? Take a guess. Absolutely. What happened is, after World War II, Konrad Adenauer, who actually was an anti-Nazi, said, there's no way we can make it up to the Jewish people. There's no way we can make up to Israel what happened here. But I'm going there. I'm going there. I'm going to apologize. I'm going to lay whatever wreaths seem necessary. I'm going to set up a reparations program. And the first reaction, Adenauer, in the Israeli press was, am I boring that person? Where is it? I'm so sorry. No problem. I'm just teasing you, for God's sakes. I said to Owen, I said, these men and women are going to be up at 10 o'clock at night listening to me? You know, I better be as succinct and as carefully orchestrated as possible. But I said all these things. The Israeli press said we're going to kill him. We don't want reparations. We don't want any Germans near us or anything else like that. And eventually won them over. He became, if you know Israeli history, he became a friend of Ben-Gurion. And of course, we have, some of you may participate in them. They're not adequate, of course, but reparation programs from Germany have been decent. When we deal with German officials, it's not like, as portrayed generally in Women in Gold. Instead, you have people who are willing to at least listen to your case. There's all kinds of procedural mechanisms which may cause problems in terms of what happens. All right, so let's go back to the looting. So it's in salt mines. It's in the Jeu de Paume. It's given to the Nazis in terms of using it. It's sold to outsiders to raise more money for the Nazi cause. Now, the Germans, led by Mr. Goebbels, did an interesting thing. They distinguished between what they called two types of art. One type of art they called degenerate art. And degenerate art was essentially modern art. Same people we just talked about. The Pizarros, the Chagalls, the Picassos, people like that. They didn't like that kind of art. So what they did is they sold it off. Well, what they wanted to do is they wanted to explain to the German people, sometimes they burned it, literally, but they wanted to explain to the German people what was good art and what was bad art. So Goebbels organizes two exhibitions. One is degenerate art, and the other one is so-called good art. The good art is pictures of half-naked German soldiers standing there with a rifle or something like that, or some nature scenes and a few old Dutch masters and a few things like that. They're not necessarily horrible paintings, but they're just not of the quality of what we're talking about. And there's two shows. Well, which show do you think had 7 times more people attended? The degenerate show. Goebbels said, I'm getting this out of here. You know, we're going to have to do something about it in terms of what happens. Now, so we had this program for the Germans. The war ends, and you've heard some of the stories of how people got out and how people couldn't get out and the like. And there, particularly this Holocaust Remembrance Week, I've been privy to a lot of stories. I want to tell you the best story because I just heard it yesterday, actually, in Pensacola, Florida. A man was describing his experiences as, you people were this evening. And he said, Don, I want to tell you a little story. He says, I was a Schindler kid. You remember the movie? The little kids would use their thumbs and they would polish the ammunition, things. That's true. And this guy's V was a Schindler kid. And his mother was there, and she was on that train to Auschwitz, and somehow she got off it, and Schindler protected her. But after the initial protection, the kid was sent to other concentration camps, separated from his mother, assumed she was dead. After the war, survivors, as some of the people who are here will know, were very concerned, very preoccupied with who lived. Who can we talk to? Who can we build a community with? What cities can we go back to, if we can go back at all, or anything else like that? So he had kind of given up. He went to Haifa, started a new life. In 1951, he gets a phone call on a Sunday morning. Zev, this is your mother. He said, can you imagine? I mean, I know we've had a lot of emotional and poignant stories and experiences, and some people have experienced them, but the kinds of things that you think about there. And then, I'll tell you, I spend so much of my time dealing with Holocaust history and the horrors and the evils and the like, that I find every once in a while I have to read a baseball book or something. I have to get my mind off it. It's so horrible, and it's so, how do you conceive of what they did? Throwing babies, it's just inconceivable. And then you read about the good people. There were some good people. Don't you say to yourself, why weren't there more? Now, how much of the underground really was there in Germany? What happened in France? What happened in Ukraine and the like? So it's sort of a mixed bag, but where we can start doing something redeeming, we like to do it. And I am happy to say that I want to report on some successes. That's why I call this talk, to the extent I organize it, it's just really more spontaneous than anything else. I call it from tragedy to triumph, because we've had some triumphs. Maria's case was fantastic. I have had some wonderful experiences in my life, birth of my kids, whatever else you want to say. I never experienced the emotion that I did the day that Randy and I told Maria we won her case. It was unbelievable. It was, well beyond what a lawyer-client does or anything else like that. So there's this kind of feeling, and the reason for it, by the way, you know some of the facts, or most of you do, or at least many of you do. But basically what happened in that case is, all the way along here, we tried to sue in Austria, because Austria had a statute to return paintings. These are valuable paintings. Why are they dealing with them? We can prove they're looted. They should be returned. And if you remember, what happened was the Austrians said, you can sue here, but you have to put up all your assets as security. And then the appellate court said, oh, you don't have to put all of them, only half of them. And then the Austrians, being the benevolent, wonderful people that they are, appealed that. No, we don't want half, we want all of it. And Maria said, we're out of here. We went to America, we went to California. We found a fantastic judge, Judge Cooper. We found travel brochures that had been addressed to the Schoenberg, Burris households and others, which talked about Austria, and also had pictures, funny enough, of the paintings. So those of you who know about law or know about legal cases, you have to have jurisdiction. Under normal conditions, just because Maria lives in California, we can't be suing the government of Austria in California, but because they were doing business in a tourist way, we were able to get jurisdiction from the first judge. The quote in the movie of Maria's, where she says, there should be more women judges, is totally true. That was something she said as soon as we walked out of Judge Cooper's courtroom in terms of what happens. We go up to the appellate court. These are the federal courts. The appellate court first rules for us, and then the Austrians get an interesting ally, the government of the United States. Now, the Bush administration did this not because it was anti-Semitic, but they did it as a matter of policy, and they sent the Solicitor General to help Austria because the Bush administration, the people there, did not believe in any limitations on sovereignty. We thought, legitimately, that one big problem we're going to have in the Supreme Court is you have the Rehnquist court, so it's a little bit slanted toward the government. But at the same time, we're going to have a problem because they're not going to want to rule against a government, particularly a government like Austria, which right now is friendly to us. To complicate things also, at the time, we were supplying weaponry and soldiers and the like through Austria. Austria was an important railroad point in terms of what happened there. So we were a little worried about that in terms of what's happening. A small aside, when we finally won, after many, many months, we got a 6-3 decision. And one of the people who voted for us and really wrote a great opinion was Scalia, who just passed away. And Scalia and Thomas split. This is a little bit of Supreme Court gossip because usually Scalia and Thomas voted together. Thomas never spoke for about 15 years. It's just the way he did it. But this time we lost Thomas but got Scalia. I got a little redemption a couple of days ago. I had a program like this in Florida, and in the program there were judges, and the justice from the Supreme Court who was the head of the federal judges that was there was Clarence Thomas. So I was giving a talk like this, and I see Thomas is looking down at his iPad. He can't remember how he voted on the case. We go to lunch, we're at the same table, and he said, he blew my mind. He said, Don, I realize now that I voted, in the minority on that, but I have to tell you something honestly. All 9 justices wanted Maria to get the paintings back. He and Rehnquist and a third justice just decided we didn't have the legal basis for it. So we got a little bit of closure in terms of what happens there, because that's the only case right now which specifically was decided by the highest court in our land, and it's a case which says that a person who was, in fact, deprived of property by the Nazis is entitled to use the American courts under proper conditions. Go back. No sovereign immunity is going to bar it. No jurisdiction is going to bar it. We're going to be able to go in. Now, I wish I could tell you that that was the attitude of the majority of the Supreme Court there. And I don't know if you understood what happened at that point. We won, but in America, those of you who have unfortunately had to deal with lawsuits, and you're the plaintiff, and you win, what do? You go to the defendant's house that afternoon and collect your money? No. In Maria's case, not only could we not do that, but in Maria's case, we had to actually have a trial on the merits. She's in her 90s. We're now able to use the federal courts. So we had a settlement conference. At the settlement conference, the Austrians came in with their first offer. They never raised an offer before that, whether that's the fault of the Austrians or the fault of the lawyers. Oh, who are the Austrians represented by? The Proskauer law firm. Judge Proskauer, if you know your Jewish history in New York, started the Proskauer firm so Jews could be employed. Now, they did something interesting. They did something interesting in the Proskauer firm. It was the LA branch, a guy named Scott Cooper, who's not Jewish. But as the case was moving along in the Supreme Court, we noticed that they were adding attorneys working on the brief. Tanya Cohen, Phil Bernstein, you know. They were trying to even something out in terms of what was happening. Anyway, they finally make an offer, and they come to us and they say, okay, tell you what, we'll have an arbitration proceeding in Austria. You'll pick an arbitrator, we'll pick one, not necessarily lawyers, and they'll pick a third neutral one. Maria really wanted to do that. She was not as torn as shown in the movie. She wanted to do that. She felt she was old. She could pass away before she got any recognition. She really wanted to do it. Randy spoke German. There was a group, as the person shown in Woman in Gold, he was real. There was a group like him who was supportive of what we did. So we had an arbitration in Austria, and we won 3-0. And there were, you know, editorials in the paper about this Burris Schoenberg group, you know, who are they basically? By the way, I didn't set foot in Vienna throughout all this period. I mean, Randy's a little more courageous than I am. I felt, you know, I have a couple of small grandchildren, and they're like, I really don't want to go to Vienna during that period of time. But anyway, in the end, paintings were awarded to us, and they were very valuable paintings. Austria had the right of first refusal to purchase the paintings at fair value, but that would have been hundreds of millions of dollars, so they wrote to us and said, get them out of here. And the LA County Museum got them out of there for us. They paid a lot of the insurance, and we were able to ship them to LA. And they were on the wall in the LA County Museum. I don't know if anybody was out in California and saw them. They're quite impressive together. And there was a picture of Randy and I actually going up the steps with our client at the same time. It's my favorite part of that room. But in addition to that, they were there. Ron Lauder then bought a painting, Ron Lauder being Estee Lauder's heir, for $135 million, The Woman in Gold. Anybody been to the Newey Gallery? It's amazing, isn't it? And you stand in front of that painting and say, just stand there, can you believe what Burris and Schoenberg did? No, I'm only kidding. I mean, it's a beautiful painting. It's incredible, and they have a wonderful Viennese coffee shop. And I'll give you a little secret, okay? Owen actually did something nice that he doesn't realize. If you go there, you haven't been to the Newey Gallery, and you quietly say to the person taking tickets, you're a very good friend of Don Burris. We have lifetime passes there. Just say you're a friend or a cousin or something like that. And a lot of people have gotten away with it, and they can get in for free. I think you say $12. So it was worth it, maybe having me. You know. But you know, one of the points I wanted to raise in all this settlement discussion and the like, we were under tremendous pressure. A lot of lawyers in America said, you're crazy. You've got the U.S. government on the run. You've got the Austrian government on the run. Have a trial. Get the paintings back through the trial. And besides, arbitration is dangerous. Well, we felt, and we were justified in the end, that we had a shot at the arbitration. We won 3-0. And at the end of the case, Randy decided to retire. He's about 28 years younger than me, and when I first brought him into the firm, I said, this is my legacy, you know? And now I'm a 73-year-old George Clooney lookalike with a lot of hair. But I'm trying to actually do these cases. We've had a number of cases that have gone off in good directions, and I actually have some slides that we weren't able to technically show tonight, but I'm giving them to Owen along with some of the materials here. Maybe we could show them sometime the slides of the case. And I'm just going to describe a couple of highlights of the cases. One case we had, there was a Picasso painting that everybody thought was gone. Nobody could find it. And a group in England found it. And they called our office. They said, you know what? We've traced it. We've traced the family roots to a young man who's a Berkeley law student. We want to recommend you guys as lawyers. Can we do that? We said, sure. And Mr. Bennington hired us to try to do something with this painting that was a very valuable Picasso painting. There were a couple of complications. The first complication is that Mrs. Alsdorf, the widow who owned it at the time, and her husband, over the years, their best friends lived in Washington for a period of time in a White House, Ronnie and Nancy, something like that. They lived in this White House, and Washington there. They were unbelievably politically connected. Another problem was that Mrs. Alsdorf actually had a wing of the Chicago Art Museum, the Alsdorf Pavilion. You know, and here we are, Mr. Benningsen, the law student, you know, saying he's entitled to them. They hired 4 law firms. They filed suits in Chicago to try to stop us, filed suit in L.A. saying there wasn't enough jurisdiction. It's a whole other story and everything else like that. In the end, interesting little footnote what happened. And it shows more of my theme, which is ecumenicism. Don't forget about all the other, you know, when there is even a hint of something bad going in the world, the Israelis pay attention to it. Bosnia was all Muslim. It doesn't matter. Pay attention to it. But this was an interesting case of somebody paying attention to us. I get a phone call. We were struggling with the cases. They were being filed all over the place. I get a phone call from an assistant U.S. attorney. I'll never forget this name, John Lee. And John says, Don, you know what? I've studied the Benningsen case. I'm going to help you. I'm going to file a federal court case based on the statute that enables the FBI and the federal authorities to protect stolen property, you know, to get it back to the rightful owners. And you're going to be listed as your client as the rightful owner in the case. And I'm going to file it. And I said, John, that's fantastic. I mean, he's going to do it the next day. I said, can I ask you why? You know what he told me? He's a Japanese American. He spent the first 5 years of his life in an internment camp in Northern California. He is completely sensitive to the suffering of any group. And he does what he can within the limits of his authority as an assistant U.S. attorney to help us. He filed suit. As soon as that suit was filed, we had a settlement conference. Mrs. Alsdorf, to her credit, because she was in her 90s also, came to L.A. We negotiated, and our client got $6.5 million for Mrs. Alsdorf to be able to keep it on her wall. Do not feel sorry for Mrs. Alsdorf. She sold it a few years later for $9 million. So she did okay in terms of what happened. Some of our cases, we had one case, it's in the slides, with a small Klimt painting worth about $1 million. This case, the Austrian government reversed course. That's all right. We agree with you. It's a looted painting. Gave it back. We were able to sell it for $1 million to the client. We had a little contingent fee on that one. So my grandkids were happy about that one. And it was not too bad. We have a really complicated case going on now. Now, when I go all over the world and ask this question, I flash on the screen a very famous historic painting by Lucas Cranach, which is Adam and Eve. And the reason it's famous, and you're not going to be able to relate to this group is much too sophisticated, intelligent, and highbrow to have ever watched Desperate Housewives. No question about it. I know that. If I ask the question, I know that. However, if you were channel surfing and you notice the fig leaf going up and down, it's a real painting. It's worth about $100 million. We're in federal court. We've been up and down the federal courts, and we're now in the district court. We're going to have a trial sometime in September over that painting. The painting was in the hands of Nazis. It had been taken from a Jewish collector named Jacques Goetsticker, and the Dutch government had a bunch of paintings that were given to it by the monuments men in that external restitution. And at the same time, they gave our clients back all the rest of the paintings, hundreds of paintings, really nice paintings, but these paintings had been given away by the Dutch earlier to a man named Stroganoff. I assume beef stroganoff is kosher, isn't it? Anything in it that would make it unkosher? Okay, I can talk about it. It's a Stroganoff family. They actually developed beef stroganoff. Captain Stroganoff, a Russian-American, said, no, that's not their painting because it was taken from my family by the Russians in the first instance, and Goetsticker then, when he bought it in the 20s and 30s, that wasn't necessarily a fair thing. So unbeknownst to our client, because it wasn't announced at the time, there wasn't notice sent or anything else like that, that painting was returned to the Stroganoff family. So now we're suing because the Stroganoff family sold it to the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, and we're suing the Norton Simon Museum to get the painting back or fair value, and it's been a kind of nightmare going up and down because of, again, the political intricacies and the like. We have cases going on now where we're dealing with real estate, we're dealing with businesses and the like. It's not easy, and by no means, are we happy with all the decisions that occur. and even some of the lawyers that we deal with, who are museum lawyers, are generally fair, but not all the time. I wish I could report to you that every time I talk to a Holocaust victim, I'm successful. You know, I'm able to get them back what they really would like, 100%. I try. I do have one policy. I talk to everybody. I feel if a Holocaust victim or a member of that family calls and wants to talk about the suffering, I will be honest with them about the legal side, but I will talk to them about the suffering. In a famous interview in the 1930s, Heinrich Himmler, one of the worst of these guys, was asked, this is before the final solution, before Wannsee, so it wasn't really that prevalent. He said, well, I don't understand. You're sending your troops out. We can understand they're killing the men, because the men serve as soldiers. We can understand you're killing the women, because the women can get pregnant and bear more soldiers and bear more people to support the Jews. But why do you have, pardon the expression with the young kids, why do you kill babies? You know, why do you, in the most awful ways imaginable? So he looked at his subordinate and he said, you know why? Because if we don't kill them now, their grandchildren can come back to try to get their property. That's my story.
Richard Silver will recite the Kaddish for the 6 million would you please rise. Anyone present who would like to join in the Kaddish is encouraged to do so if you have at least one parent deceased.
Bishem